I'm representing the Native Plant Society of Texas, and I thought, well, this is a perfect time of year to talk about ways to get your native plant garden through the winter. So that's kind of where I'm going to focus. I have three kind of mini topics, and I will pause in between each one. And again, please don't hesitate to let Bethany know if you have any questions while I'm talking. So here's what I'm planning on covering. Just some basic tips on how to get your garden through the winter and what it might look like in the winter, because a native plant garden doesn't necessarily look like a traditional garden a lot of times. What about planting your native seeds? You know, what are the best tips for planting your seeds? And also, this happens to be one of the best times of year to plant your trees and shrubs. So I thought I'd add a little bit about that as well. So some basic tips for how to get your garden through the winter. Now, most of what I'm going to talk about focuses on perennials, but I thought I might as well mention the annuals as well, because a lot of us love to grow things like our bluebonnets and other annuals. And I know those are long since done, but some of the tips apply to both. So if you're going to go about planting a wildflower garden, one of the advantages of that is that you're not buying plants from some big box store or nursery every single year. You can let your flowers go to seed if you're able to do that. So that's what your bluebonnets typically look like, right? As they go to seed, they get all pretty dry, and there's one of two things you can do with your annuals, especially the early ones like the bluebonnets. You can let the seeds drop on the ground and just leave them there for next year. But if you're planning to transition your garden to something else for the rest of the year, you might want to consider gathering the seeds and storing them until the end of the year when you can cast them, like I'm going to talk about in a little bit. A couple things that I would caution about: make sure those seeds are very dry before you store them. You can store them in closed containers once they're well dried, even Ziploc bags if that's what you've got handy. My container of choice is the nice cheap paper lunch bags. And then I just label each one with my different kinds of seeds that I'm storing, because I actually have had a couple situations even recently where seeds were stored in Ziploc bags or even little plastic containers with lids a little too soon, and they molded. So just, be aware of that. Make sure they're really, really dry. But of course, once these, well, I'll come back to it in a minute, but once these totally dry, the annuals, they're pretty easy to pull out of the ground. Like I said, most of my presentation is going to really focus on the bigger perennials and shrubs. I guess I have a lot of those in my garden, so that's what I kind of think about. And one of the tips that we usually try to pass on to people about trimming your plants back is that if you can, the ideal time to trim all those perennials back is around the middle of February, maybe by the end of February, because by the end of February, they're starting to put on new growth. So you want them trimmed back by then. So why is it we keep telling people to wait so long? Well, one of the main reasons, I tried to grab a couple pictures that exemplified that idea, that the wildlife really rely on that food for the winter. So there's seeds, there's little fruits, berries that they can use throughout the winter. It's also really good cover for the wildlife, even if it's just insects. I know a lot of people aren't fans of insects, but a really healthy garden is also going to have insects. And also, you know, you've got plants that have just finished flowering. This is a lantana I have in my garden, and notice that it puts on some really nice berries, by the way, that the birds really do like. Um, but if you let it go a little bit longer, you can also gather some good seeds from those perennials for another year, especially if you're looking to expand your own garden, right? Now you've got more material to expand your garden. One of the things I really enjoy doing that we do with our Native Plant Society chapter is do a seed exchange. So it's something you could even think about doing within your neighborhood or amongst a few of your friends if you're raising some really nice plants that you want to, you know, exchange with one another. I just added a lot more potentially for next year by exchanging seeds with my friends. If you live in a neighborhood that has an HOA, which I know a lot of people do, you'll have to make some adjustments to what I'm talking about. So maybe in the front yard, you can't do this as much, or maybe you have to trim a little bit more throughout the year to keep it looking good. And maybe you can do a little bit more of what I'm talking about in your backyard. I don't happen to live in an HOA, so I really do let my garden go through the winter for the wildlife. How much should you trim your plants? Well, it kind of depends on the plant. Again, if it's an annual, like your lovely bluebonnets, as soon as they're completely spent and dried up, if you've grown bluebonnets, you know they're pretty easy to just pull right out of the ground. And then those are done for the year and you've got your seeds for next time. If it's a shrub, a good perennial, somewhere around 6 inches from the ground is a pretty good guideline, although I do vary that a little bit. So I'm going to give you a couple examples from my own garden. This is my rock rose, which, you know, is waning pretty, you know, these pictures were taken pretty recently, so it's not in its full lovely bloom. But with a plant like rock rose, it's one of my favorites, a really nice shrub, but notice it can get really leggy. And so it ends up trailing all over, you know, my sidewalk and places around where I don't necessarily want it. So that's most of what I do with the rock rose, is just trim it back so that I get more of a upward growth shrub and not quite so much of that leggy trailing kind of growth. But again, I always let this one go to seed. It makes these lovely little seed pods. By the way, this is a super easy one to grow from seed. I've always had really good luck with it. Another one that I've started recently is Shrubby Bone Set, and it's not real big right now. It's maybe a couple feet tall, and I probably would go ahead and trim this back most, you know, down to maybe about 6 inches. In February, it will lose all of its leaves. So I'll just trim it back so that it can have nice fresh growth for next year. Zexmania is another very large shrub, which I'll show you some of these as flowering later in my presentation. But again, this one, as you notice, provides a lot of good seed and cover for wildlife during the winter. It's very dense. And then in the spring, I'm going to trim it back down to about where I see new growth happening. So my Zexmania shrubs are pretty big. They're several feet tall. So I may not trim them back quite that much, you know, quite down to 6 inches, but to where I see new growth. This is one of my favorites, Mealy Blue Sage. And again, it's providing some really nice seed right now. Plus I'm pulling some seed to start some new ones, but notice this one's really easy to do because you can always see there's, even right now, there's new growth happening. So in February, I'm just going to trim all that dead off and let that new growth be the primary growth. Lantana, so this is just another close-up of my same lantana. This one really seems to die back in the winter time. I love lantana, but it's already, because of the freeze we had, the leaves are all black now, and it will lose them all, and it will die back sometimes fairly far. So I will cut this way down in February, maybe probably the 6-inch, maybe even a little bit lower, depending on how many cold days we've had. If we've had a lot, lantana is going to die back pretty far, but I've had it come back. I have cut it down almost to the ground, like a few inches, and I've had it come back. So don't despair and think that you've got to go buy more. Most of the time they do come back. There we go.
Hey, Debbie, we had a question.
Yes.
Does the mealy blue sage and lantana grow easily from seed, or is that fairly difficult?
The mealy blue grows really well from seed. In fact, I already have a new little plant right down here next to my other one, so I'm hoping to get a nice little grouping here soon. So that one seems to grow really easily. Lantana, I haven't worked with a whole lot. It does grow really well from cuttings too, by the way. I've had pretty good luck with cuttings, and I feel like they'll probably grow pretty well from seed as well. So that one's pretty easy. Okay, so sorry, backing up for a second. That pretty much finishes that first topic. There's really not a lot to talk about right now, except if you can, let your plants go through the winter. If you're able to do that as much as you can, the wildlife will appreciate it. You can collect seed from it if you want to expand your garden. And then you get new growth in February. So that's all I had for that particular segment. I don't know if anybody had any other questions or experiences on that same note. I mean, everybody has their own favorites that they're growing, and sometimes there's a little variability in what the best practice is.
So Debbie, would you say that those could be grown from cuttings from the green growth, or just seeds probably?
So one of the things I hadn't even thought about, and it was actually explained to us from one of our nursery partners, South Texas Growers. She said, well, think about in February when you're trimming back. So I'm trimming off, say in February, a bunch of these little branch bits, stick them in the ground. That can be your cuttings to start the next year. Now I do buy, it's called Root Tone from Lowe's, or that's the place I found it easily. I'm sure Home Depot, all those kind of places have it. It's a powder. It's a growth hormone for plants. And I do dip my little cuttings in Root Tone and then just put them in a small pot and get them started. And when you're starting plants from cuttings, don't put them in the sun. And you do want most of the leaves, most if not all of the leaves gone anyway. You need to let the plant put its efforts into the root system at that point. So yeah, so I never really thought about it that, hey, February is a great time to start a bunch of cuttings because you're trimming your plants anyway. Okay, so this is also a great time of year to put out your native plant seeds. They are dropping all through the year too if you're growing native plants, but this is a great time to do it. September through December is a really good time. It's cooler. We're starting to get some rain again, usually. We finally did. And so it's a good time for them to get started. Depending on when you put those seeds down, and I took some of this information out of some native plant seed catalogs. some tips. If you put them down, say September, October, maybe even to November, there's a good chance that they're going to sprout. And that's okay. They can sprout, they can get a little bit of green growth, a little rosette, and they're going to go dormant. They're going to be fine through the winter. They shouldn't do much more than that. If you sow your seeds fairly late, like now, it's still okay to do, but there's a good chance that they're just going to stay dormant until the spring. So you may see nothing, but that's okay. What are some of the best areas to put your wildflowers? Well, there are exceptions to every rule, but by and large, you want good drainage. So don't pick places where water tends to gather or pool, where you see lots of weeds coming up in your yard. That's probably going to be too wet for most of our wildflowers. And most of them really appreciate a lot of sun, 5 to 8 hours per day. But again, I'm going to give you some varieties here if you want some suggestions. I went through a catalog and looked for some that were easy to find, easy to buy, and provide a lot of nice color. So I'll get to that in just a minute. But there are some suggestions for preparing your garden. And of course, it does depend on whether you're putting these seeds in a flower bed, or if you're trying to cast them out to a wider area. If you've got a bigger piece of property, it does vary a little bit, but these rules pretty much apply everywhere. You don't want to apply the seeds right on other vegetation. So whether you're doing this in a flower bed or out in your yard, take away some of the existing vegetation if there is some there. So you have a little bit more of an open space. Rake up the surface of the soil a little bit just to loosen it. You're not going to plant your native seeds very deep, about an inch, that's all. That's where some people have trouble with native seeds, is they try to plant them too deeply. So rake up the soil a little bit, spread the seed out however you want it, and you just kind of lightly pat your seeds into the soil, or just kind of lightly brush the soil back over your seeds and pat it down. Or if you're throwing them on the ground, not in a flower bed, you might want to walk over, where you just put them down. You still may see some of your seeds, okay? They may not be completely buried, and that's okay. It's okay that they're not all under the soil. But just raking up the surface of the soil a little bit is going to help them get started when they do start to sprout. How much do you need to take care of these plants that you're just putting in? Especially if you're doing this in a flower bed and you know exactly where you put them, you might want to keep it watered and moist. Again, especially if you had put them in September, October, and there's a good chance that they're going to sprout. Keep the ground moist so they do have that opportunity. And then reduce your watering once you see them come up. They don't have to be up very much. When I'm putting seeds out over a larger area, I just try to time my my seeding based on the forecast for a decent rain. So I made sure I put some of my seed down just before this past weekend, and then we had some good rain. So that will help my seeds as they go into the spring. Typically, fertilizer is not recommended for your native plants. They don't need it. They don't even necessarily want it. It can actually harm them more than help them. So you can save your money, right? You don't have to put fertilizer on these. Here's a couple good seed sources. Native American Seed is a nice big company, and they have quite a good selection. Um, Also, Wild Seed Farms that's in Fredericksburg is another nice source. The only caution I would have about Wild Seed Farms is that they sell a lot of mixtures. And one of their favorite plants to add into the mixtures is Cosmos, which is fine, but it is not a native plant. So if you're going for a native plant garden, I would just look through their individuals, which they do have a lot of individual seed packets as well. I just stocked up from them not too long ago. So I took a couple pictures of my garden. It's really still in development stages, and I like mine kind of messy the way it looks. But I thought, well, one of the things I'd address during this segment is how can I choose my plants and what are some good choices for some, especially, you know, some dramatic plants, big plants, some nice color. So the rest of this little segment, I went ahead and did a little bit of research on some good suggestions, ones that I think you can find seeds for, oh, there we go, for your seeds. So sometimes we do have shady areas, right? And there are native plants that do well in your shadier spots. So don't feel like you can't use native seeds in shady areas. And I kind of did this in a clockwise fashion. But cedar sage, tropical sage, which is a little bit taller. I know I'm calling them ground cover, but I'm calling them that not so much because they're so low, but because they'll fill in really well, right? And be kind of the lower part of a flower bed that you might be doing. This is prairie verbena, one of my favorites. It does well in the sun also, but I keep having it pop up on its own in my yard in the shadier spots. So it seems to also like shady spots under trees and stuff. This is columbine. This one's called Hinckley's columbine, although from what I'm hearing, this columbine is hybridized so much, I'm not sure if there's anything really called Hinckley's anymore. But columbine also likes the shade. And this is one that I've just started playing with in my garden called Heartleaf Skullcap. Very nice. Now, I will caution that the sages are somewhat deer resistant, although they do have some tender parts and the flowers are yum yum. But the deer will not bother the sages too much. There's a good chance they're gonna eat, a lot of the rest of this. So, put it in a protected area, but they grow very nicely in the shade. I also have two that I chose that are more shrubby, that are my favorites. Turk's Cap is one, and again, it'll fill in really, really well. Very pretty, and grow quite well in the shade. It will grow, this one, as well as rock rose, will grow in the shade or sun. It'll vary the amount of flowering you get and the amount of watering you have to do. So Turk's Cap especially I think does much better in the shade. Rock rose, I actually have one. Mine is in the sun, but I do have to water it a bit extra because of that. But anyway, both of these very nice shrubby plants that will do well in some shade. Then, of course, you've got your sunny areas, which is most of what we have around here. And most of our wildflowers love, love, love sun. These are some of my favorites, and especially if you're looking for some color. This is one of my big, big favorites, Blackfoot Daisy, and it loves rocky situations just like that. Absolutely adores it. So does Calliophus, actually, which is a primrose, and there's a number of primroses out there. I just picked this one because it's a really hardy one and it loves rocky spots. Coreopsis, is another nice colorful choice, and does well. And there's a number of different coreopsis types around here. This is just a typical one. And again, one of my personal favorites, it's a little bit taller, so I'm not sure if you'd really call it ground cover, but it's called Gara. And it's also a technically a primrose, but it's just so delicate looking that I love it, but it's so hardy. It will grow in rocks and in some pretty bad soil. So I love Gara for that. Couple other really nice, colorful ones that are pretty easy to find. This one actually grows wild a lot. I have it come up in my yard a lot, called green thread. Pretty little daisy plant. It's a spring. Yeah, spring. And then cone flowers. Of course, we have lots of different kinds of cone flowers that are common around here and very prolific. Once you get those started, where you have one, you'll have a lot. And then, of course, blanket flower or Indian blanket or whatever you choose to call it. We have a couple different versions of that, but those are all nice, kind of full, they'll fill in some spots pretty quickly and provide some good ground cover, or the lower section of a garden that you might be doing. And then these are a little bit taller, a little bit shrubbier, that also do super well in the sun. These are some of my personal favorites lately. Damianita is amazing. It loves this kind of rocky situation. It makes this beautiful, kind of an evergreen-ish shrub. It will stay green throughout the most of the winter and put on these beautiful little yellow daisy flowers. But that is one of the hardiest, shrubbiest things I have seen around here. I use it to stabilize my rocky hillside. Same with Texas fall aster. That's actually also a pretty hardy plant and pretty easy to grow from seed. Easy to, it will spread itself pretty rapidly. There's quite a lot of it. Boy, if you ever want a good garden to go look at for some of these as examples, go up to Ty Preston Library's Butterfly Garden. Hopefully we'll get a good one started at Mammon soon, but Ty Preston has one that's been established for a few years, and you can see most of these plants there. Greg's Mist, that one to me seems like it takes a little bit more water, but when it does bloom, and it's just this kind of, kind of frilly looking little blue flower, the butterflies adore it. The monarchs, the queens, oh my goodness, they'll just cover those plants. They absolutely adore it. And then this is also, I think it's a very striking kind of plant. It's called Liatris. Some people call it blazing star, or, oh my gosh, the other name just escaped me. Can't think of it. Anyway, very, very striking, very colorful plants that will do well in super sunny areas around here. Couple more really good shrubs for this area. Mealy blue sage, again, that's fairly deer resistant, as well as your good old autumn sage, the Salvia gregae, which is pretty popular around here. Zexmania is one that I really like. I have quite a lot of it in my yard. It just was there already when I moved in. And those shrubs that I have are, I don't know, 3 feet or so tall. They are big and full and pretty hardy. And then standing cypress is a really interesting kind of shrubby plant. The only thing about standing cypress is it's a biennial, which means that it's going to come up in the first year, but it's not going to do anything. And then in the second year, it's going to flower all pretty like that. And then you'll need to gather seed because it'll be done. So if you can offset it, you could have some that is flowering every year, but you just have to keep in mind that it is a biennial, so that's just kind of different.
Debbie, we had a question
Yes.
about the Zexminia actually a
Mhm.
little while ago. Um, and I asked it, but I was on mute, so I'll try it again. But they were saying they were having a hard time growing it. It has stayed small. Any suggestions?
I wish I did. I already had some established plants when I moved here, and they just keep coming up. I could probably supply the whole county with Zexmania plants. They just keep popping up all over my yard. Um, Now, it depends on the year. I've had, so I've been in this house 4 years now, and there have been a couple summers where the rain, the timing of rain was a little bit off, and it greened up and it looked great, and then it just didn't flower, or it didn't flower until the fall, or it flowered a little bit. Like this year, I think it flowered pretty well in the early summer, and then it just kind of stopped. It was, remember, it was so dry. And then when we had all that wonderful rain in September, it flowered again. So it will, it will kind of go a bit dormant, I guess, if you will, until there's a decent rain, unless you're watering it. And I don't know. I'm starting to wonder if some of our native plants aren't that keen to be watered a bunch when we're having that hot, dry weather. I think they just really don't want to do anything. Um, so the one thing I guess the one thing I could say about having a native plant garden around here is that it looks a little different every year. It really did. And the same thing about planting seed. If you're being very precise and very careful about where you're putting them in a flower bed, you can probably keep it kind of looking similar year to year. But they like to spread, they like to go here and there, and sometimes this plant is waning this year, but that one is doing really well. My Greg's Mist just refused to flower this year, and I heard other people saying the exact same thing. We weren't getting the right rain at the right time, and it just didn't want to do anything. So my garden looks a little different each year. That's about the only thing that's constant, is that it's always different. um, I think that is, yeah. So the only other thing I threw in here about planting your seeds is you can also think about what your goal is. And a lot of times there's information about what these different wildflowers will do for you. Is it providing good food for birds? Is it the right shape of flower for hummingbirds? Is it providing good nectar or host plants for your butterflies? And I do have a couple of resources I was going to share. So SAWS has some good information that they keep putting out. Now that's a picture of one of the issues that they sent out a couple of years ago. But you can go to their website, gardenstylesa.com, and they have some good guides. Also, this has been a really great little resource. It's called the Grow Green Book, um, and it comes out of Austin. And I discovered when I was putting together a previous presentation that you can actually go online and find this entire book online now. And it has good suggestions for native and adapted plants, and it will tell you some things that, some ways that it's useful for wildlife in your garden. So there's good resources for figuring out what you can hope to attract to your garden, depending on what you want to grow or what you want to accomplish. But I think that's the end of that particular segment on native seeds. And then my last piece is on trees and shrubs. So anybody have any other questions about
Debbie,
Thank
we
you.
did have a few written
Mhm.
in, kind of along with the goals section. They were having some issues of critters getting their seeds they put out, and specifically squirrels. Do you have any suggestions on that?
And it can happen. um, so you can bury your seeds a bit, but again, I would be careful about burying them more than about an inch. If you do sow them right on the ground, which sometimes I do, um, I have to keep that in mind. I'm probably going to lose some to wildlife. Um, so you might want to get some started in your flower beds or whatever, and make sure they're buried a little bit. If you really want to protect what you're trying to do, you could try starting some in little pots. You know, it's going to take a little more care on your part, but you could wait till those plants are more sprouted and put them in the ground in the early spring or late winter. You know, because yeah, you are, some of what you're purchasing, some of that seed is probably going to go to the wildlife. So that just happens. Mhm.
Debbie, we had another question
Mhm.
on, let me find it, it popped back. The Mexican mint marigold, they were asking if they should cut back now or in February. They've already cut off some tops to save seeds. How about the rest of the plant, though?
Well, as a rule, like I said, if you're able to, if it's not a problem with your HOA or whatever, um, I leave everything until about the middle of February. And it just kind of depends on, you know, how warm of February we're getting. You know, if I see my plants starting to put out new growth again, then I'll try to make sure I get out there and trim them. But I don't usually do it now. So that's just been my habit.
And then another question about seeds. If they just purchased them, when would they plant them right now?
So now is still a good time. At this point, with the cold weather that we're having, I wouldn't necessarily expect to see them sprout. I just put some in, and I don't know that I'll see them until the spring. So, you know, you might need to mark where you put them, or if you're putting them in a flower bed, you might have better feel for, you know, what is where. But I wouldn't necessarily expect to see them sprout, but I'd still put them in the ground.
Um, and then a final one. They're not sure if you're the hummingbird expert or not, but they thought they'd throw it out. What about hummingbirds coming out? They've only had one at a time instead of several. Does anybody have any ideas how to attract more? So,
It just takes a little time. I don't know how much time they've spent at it. And of course, right now, unless you've been feeding really, really regularly, most of our hummingbirds, I know mine, have departed. You have to be really vigilant about keeping that food out to keep some of them through the winter, which they will sometimes. So I don't usually see them again until the middle of March. That's usually my guideline for when to get my feeders ready to go, is middle of March. And once they start understanding that there's a reliable source of food, I feel like more and more of them will come. It just takes a little while to draw them.
mhm.
And if you also have some early spring plants that will attract them, I started a vine called coral honeysuckle, which is a native plant. So I wasn't talking about vines today, but it's a really good one because it's an early bloomer and it has the right shape for the hummingbirds. So that can also get them encouraged to come and to stay if there's flowers blooming and you've got feeders out.
Great. Thank you, Debbie. We had a comment. Someone has also seen a lot of hummingbirds March through June of this year. So that kind of goes along with your mention there. And then someone asked, are Mexican geraniums, ger, geraniums? I think so, native.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
It's not a plant I'm familiar with. I don't think so. All right, so I had one more short little bit because again, now that the weather is cooler and we've had some rain, if you're thinking about putting in trees or shrubs, this is a good time to do that. So that's my last bit of tips. So fall and winter is when I try to do that kind of planting. Again, temps are lower. Rain is usually with us then, so you don't have to water quite as much. And I just had a couple basic tips that I have picked up over this last year, couple years. One of the big things about planting a tree is to make sure the hole is the correct size. Now, my dear husband, he has to use a jackhammer to do this because we don't really have soil where we are. But I went ahead and put one of my pots in the ground that we were working on recently and noticed that we haven't made the hole terribly deep. It only has to be as deep as the first roots on that tree. So you don't have to make it super deep, but your goal should be to make it about twice as big around as your pot is that you're putting in, okay? So give it some lateral space. That's a lot more important. Get your tree out of the pot and get it prepped. If it's got some, some bound up roots, you can loosen those with your hand and just make sure that it's going to be able to spread. A tip that I just heard recently this year is, especially when you're planting a tree around here, you should go ahead and fill that hole with water before you put your tree in. A lot easier than trying to pour gallons and gallons of water on top after you do it. Fill the hole with water and before you put your tree in. And then get your tree in the ground. Start putting some soil in. I did have a nice pile of decent soil, so I was giving my plants a little extra head start, but I picked this one particularly because you can see very clearly that there are a couple side roots on this particular little tree, and I am not going to put the soil too much above that highest lateral root. Okay, so the soil should not be going up this this little trunk. So here's one that I also put in the ground, and you couldn't see the lateral roots as well with that one, but they started right around there. So filled it in with soil. I do have a plant food that I usually add to new trees, especially since a couple of these we pulled out of the ground on our own property and they didn't have a whole lot of roots with them. If I'm purchasing a tree, I still might even put some plant food in to get it started. And what I decided to add to this, some of the resources that you can find on our chapter website, which I have at the end of this, is some alternatives that we like to suggest, some native tree alternatives, because all of the native plants around here are important host plants for a variety of insects, which serve as food for almost all of our birds. Butterflies are very specific to how they lay their eggs. So I think it's important to consider some native plants. And this is a non-native that a lot of people like to grow, but there's a lot of good native alternatives that you can find. It's getting easier to find the natives. And these are some you might want to consider. So if you were thinking about putting in a Chinese tallow, maybe think about a lacy oak. They're very nice little oaks, a cedar elm, or a native pecan. Those are going to be pretty trees, and they are natives. If you were thinking about a mimosa, because you like the color and the look of it, maybe consider instead a desert willow. It's a little bit more of a shrubby tree, but it's very pretty, and the hummingbirds love it. A native redbud also provides quite a lot of color in your yard. And the golden lead ball tree is a native and has that same kind of flower as a mimosa. It's just our native version. And I will give you some nurseries where you can find some of these trees in just a minute. If you're going to put in a Chinese pistache, because those have been very popular. Think about a chinkapin oak. I just bought that for a friend. I saw the pictures of it and I thought, oh, that grows up to a pretty little tree. Or a Texas red oak. Instead of putting in Vitex, and I know that's even been the Texas A&M superstar kind of tree, I don't think it still is, thankfully, because it tends to spread itself way too easily. It's very aggressive. So if you're thinking about Vitex, because you like the color, maybe rethink Mexican plum, beautiful flowers in the spring. This is an Anacacho orchid tree, so it's not actually an orchid, but it's got very pretty flowers. Or a Mexican buckeye, all very pretty smaller trees that make good alternatives. So these are my last resources. One of the things that the Native Plant Society does is really promote the use of native plants. So we have this program called the NICE program, which stands for Natives Improve and Conserve Environments. And you can find more about our suggested plants for each year on our website. So that's our website. And also we are partners now with 4 local nurseries that attempt to sell as many natives as they can find. So the Canyon Lake Ace Hardware up in Sattler, nice little store. They do a really good job. South Texas Growers out on Highway 46, just west of the HEB and that shopping area. She's very knowledgeable, very nice lady. I buy from them quite often. One of our newest partner is Spring Creek Gardens on 281. And I haven't had the pleasure of being there yet. And then if you're a little bit further north, King Feed up in Wimberley is also a really good choice. So those are nurseries where you can expect to have people that are more knowledgeable about native plants and actually have them to sell as much as they can. Okay, so you can check out, I know South Texas Growers has a nice website and featured plants and things like that. So it's a good source of information.
Debbie, do you or do any of the participants off the top of their head remember seeing the desert willow in any of these? We were chatting on the chat that we hadn't been able to find it yet.
So I actually just purchased one a couple weeks ago. South Texas Growers, where I typically go, did not have them. I haven't checked the others. I knew I had found it at Millburgers before, and they did have quite a good selection of them. And they have, personally, I like the smaller tree. I put in about a 3-gallon size, and I think the 3-gallon size was about $30.
Nice.
So it's not too expensive, and it just seems like they're a lot easier to get started. If you buy a very large tree, you know, a 10-gallon or bigger tree, you're going to do a lot more work taking care of that tree. Even my little trees that I put in, I didn't water this week because we had that rain. But in the first year, I'm going to go out there and put a gallon or 2 on them pretty frequently, at least once a week, till they really get started. So I do take care of my native trees, at least in the first year. And then I kind of watch them after that. But that is my last slide. That's all I have. So I don't know if you have any other questions.
They have been chatting. We did have one other question. Do you happen to know of any plants that support the native plant partners in New Braunfels for our listeners from that area?
I would suggest that they go to the nipsot.org. So just the basic nativeplants.org website, and look for the New Braunfels chapter. All the chapters are listed on that state website. And on their own website, they should have their partners. And I know they do have partners. So yeah, I would go to their website and look. Anything else?
We haven't had any more chatted questions, but they might be typing right now.
All right.
Y'all
Well,
feel free to unmute yourselves and ask questions, though. That is totally okay.
I'm going to stop sharing. Come on. Oh, there we go. Sorry, my computer's being slow today. There we go. Okay, so I don't know if there's any other questions, I'm happy to answer them.
I have a question on the red oaks. Like, I think there's one called a Shumard and then a Texas. Do you know the difference? Or
I am not an oak expert. I will freely admit. So I would go to the nurseries or look online and see if you can tell them apart. Sometimes some of them are very similar. Anything else?
I just want to thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. I hope it was helpful. I know this is not a time of year when people necessarily think about gardens, but it's a part of the year I've been looking forward to. I know my husband probably hasn't, because I had a whole lineup of trees I wanted to go in the ground, but but this is a time of year I look forward to. So,
Debbie, we did have one other question. How long do like oak tree acorns last before you can plant them? Someone has some that are about 8 years old now. Do you think they'd still be good?
it's quite possible. A lot of seeds last for many years, which again explains why, 1 year my garden will look one way and another year it looks another way. And, suddenly I have something pop up that I haven't seen in years, so I would imagine there's probably at least some of them that are viable.
Well, we've had a lot of thank yous and how good this was, Debbie. I think everybody really appreciates it. And Anne even said it's been wonderful for a new Texas gardener who's moved into a long neglected yard in January.
Oh,
She was
good.
encouraged. So there we go. We
Very
all feel you there.
Well, enjoy. It's fun.
And guys, I think we're going to try to do this about once a quarter. So we will kind of have a topic perhaps we were discussing and then a lot of discussion after it. So anyway, thank you so much. And thank you, Debbie. I know I learned a lot, as always, as I do in all of y'all's programs. So appreciate it.
You're very welcome. I'm glad you all made it.
All right.
Very
Bye-bye.
good. Bye, y'all. Have a good week.
You too.
Bye.